There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy upon humankind. Those to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that they lack nothing of all that they desire. Yet God does not enable them to enjoy those things, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous ill. Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verses 1 to 2. Hey everyone, I'm back with some good, lighthearted, murder. It's been a little while since I've given you an Agatha Christie review, so I'm back with the next Hercule Poirot novel in the sequence, which is Evil Under the Sun. The title is a double reference to a Bible verse that is mentioned during the novel, but the Under the Sun is quite literal, referring to a sunbathing vacation on which Hercule Poirot finds himself among some guests with some interesting romantic entanglements. As always for the Poirot series, I'll keep the first half of the video spoiler-free, and then give you a warning before I get into the spoiler section. Having read Christie's prior Poirot novella collection, Murder in the Mews, not too long ago, it was impossible not to notice the similarities between the setup of this story and her novella Triangle at Rhodes from that collection. For what it's worth, I enjoyed Triangle at Rhodes and thought the sunbathing vacation environment of Rhodes in Greece was a fun environment setting a fun mood to the story, although it felt like it ended rather abruptly, and I wouldn't have minded it going on for a while longer. And in Evil Under the Sun, it basically does go on for a while longer. This one's a full-length novel, and instead of ending basically right at the time of the crime, it's only just beginning then. Unfortunately, it was a little challenging for me to get through the start because it was so similar in setup to Triangle at Rhodes that I found myself wondering if it was indeed the exact same story just developed further with a very prolonged investigation. We even see another such love triangle forming, as well as a direct warning from Poirot to the would-be murderer to think twice about the consequences of his or her actions. Well, it turns out in terms of the mystery investigation, it's not the exact same story, which is why I don't feel too concerned about making this comparison in the spoiler-free section, because you can pretty much consider it a fresh story once the murder takes place, since it's performed in a different way, and that's what signaled to me that I had to just treat all suspects and all explanations with equal suspicion. But this similarity, which almost seemed like Evil Under the Sun was just copying the whole first third of the book directly from Rhodes, did bore me a little bit towards the start of the book and decreased my overall interest, and made this book just harder for me to get into than most. I felt impatient thinking, alright, I've seen this all before, which was a bit of a shame because thinking about it all on its own as an independent work, I quite liked the setting and the whole introduction of this mystery, and I probably would have appreciated it more had Triangle at Rhodes not been published beforehand. Moving past that, though, this is a novel that I enjoyed, but I would place it in the middle of the pack among Christie's Poirot mysteries. First of all, there are a lot of side characters in this one who, as always, we can't really be exactly certain are true side characters, but if they are, they feel a little bit more tangential than they do in other Poirot mysteries. I got the feeling that they were around mostly as witnesses, maybe with one or two of them involved in a side plot, but probably not involved in the murder themselves, and in the spoiler section we can discuss whether I was actually right about this. Some of them are still fun, such as the talkative general or the old married couple, but I suspect that most readers will not find much reason to suspect them early on, at least of the murder itself. It's a solid mystery, it's just that for some reason it didn't feel the most memorable to me. Which is a little weird because the beach setting is fairly different from at least her other full-length Poirot novels, even if not quite as inherently unique as something like Death on the Nile or Murder in Mesopotamia. I guess it's just that the mystery plot itself, though interesting enough, didn't really have anything in it that by the end left me thinking, wow, that was absolutely genius, or that just surprised me in the best possible way that an Agatha Christie mystery can. It's still a book worth your time, just not the first one I'd recommend for new Christie fans. Anyway, I'm sorry for this one, that was a little bit of a short spoiler-free section, but I'm going to really need to talk about the ending to get into this anymore, so now's your chance to bounce if you're going to read this one yourself. Okay, so I'm going to walk through my thought process in solving this murder. I rightly assumed that most of the characters were not real suspects, which if you've read a lot of Christie can be a dangerous assumption, but for me the only real suspects were Patrick and Christine Redfern, Kenneth Marshall, Linda the stepdaughter, and Rosamund Darnley, who we learn had a little thing for Kenneth in the past and maybe still does. As for the other characters, I guess that they might have been involved in some kind of blackmail, running drugs, the usual fare. Nothing directly related to the murder itself, but enough to entangle with the important stuff and get us readers confused. So there were 5 primary suspects, which I think is quite interesting because it's a fairly limited pool of suspects and allows the reader to really consider each one in detail, instead of just throwing up our hands in confusion. Of these 5 primary suspects, though, Rosamund for me never seemed to have quite the level of motive or opportunity that the others did. Patrick seemed to me highly unlikely since he was there when the body was discovered and had been looking for the victim, Arlena, that very morning, suggesting he was as surprised as anyone that she was missing. Kenneth suffered from the classic condition of being so suspicious from the start that we should question whether he really could be the murderer, like whether Agatha Christie would be drawing so much attention to him then. I never really did fully rule him out, but I wasn't suspecting him much by the end because this particular crime also seemed out of character for him based on the testimonies we heard from the other characters who knew him. Similarly, Christine Redford seemed like she certainly had a possible motive, but it didn't seem like we learned enough about her to say much more than that. At the start, I certainly considered the possibility that, contrary to appearance, she was somehow romantically entangled with Kenneth Marshall and pulled off the crime along with him, but by the middle, it was clear that there was simply no evidence for this. I also wondered whether Linda could have pulled off the crime and Christine covered for her, since the two seemed to have developed a sort of rapport. So I was close to being onto something since Christine was indeed an accessory to the murder, but I can't really give myself credit for it because it didn't really go beyond the level of mere speculation there. Now, I was suspicious about whether the actual report of death by strangulation was correct. For a while, I was wondering if the fact that the murder likely occurred in this cave at Pixie Cove actually meant that Arlena had suffocated due to a lack of oxygen, and then some extra work had been done afterwards to make it look like it was strangulation. This in particular would have completely nullified the whole defense of, oh, it must be a man because women are far too weak to have done such a difficult crime, that supposedly placed several of the characters out of real suspicion. It also would have had physiological effects similar to strangulation, aside from the marks of a struggle on the body. And for me, this is what for most of the middle of the novel led me to suspect Linda. Although her exact motives and methods were unclear to me, the possession of the candles was especially suspicious. Like, had she somehow used them within the cave to add smoke and further deplete the oxygen, and then lured Arlena down to the cave for a secret rendezvous, trapped her inside somehow so that she couldn't escape, and she suffocated? It was only towards the end of the novel, when Linda started becoming almost too suspicious, that I began doubting myself. But at that point, it was too late, and I really couldn't find anyone else whom I suspected more. So yeah, I was duped. I mentioned that Patrick seemed unlikely because he was looking for his wife in the morning, and yeah, that was the whole point. It was all part of the show. I fell for it, particularly due to his whole performance in the boat while out rowing with Emily Brewster. The solution itself was fairly clever in my opinion, and I suspect that at least some readers more clever than me might have at least surmised that the so-called body of Arlena that Patrick discovered on the shore was not actually dead, nor was it even Arlena Marshall in the first place. And there were some pretty good clues too, although I do wonder if anyone was actually able to connect the bottle thrown out of the window with the fake suntan that Christine Redford applied to make herself look like Arlena. Even if you were able to tell that something was up, I think it would have been awfully hard to figure out. I am curious, though, what's the closest anyone was able to get to figuring this out. There were, of course, a few aspects of the solution and investigation that I found weak. First of all, the whole idea that someone could have come from off of the island and done the crime didn't enhance the story, and I think the crime would have been better contained on the island. It seems here as if Agatha Christie is just trying to say, wait, don't forget about these other characters aside from the main 5 suspects, like, don't forget about Horace Blatt because he's smuggling drugs, and you never know if one of them might have been involved too, or someone else entirely. Of course, it obviously wasn't going to be someone else. I feel like it would have worked better if Christie had just stuck to the impression she gave at first, that it is one of these main suspects, it's someone on the island, but I challenge you to figure out which one. Since apparently, at least for me, even that wasn't enough to figure it out, despite the fact that I did rightly dismiss all of these 5 main suspects pretty early on. Interestingly, in 5 Little Pigs, which is the next novel in the Poirot sequence, and which I've read already, so I'll be reviewing it soon, she does just that and unambiguously lays out a field of 5 potential suspects right from the start. Besides that, a few other things that I didn't like were, for one, this whole thing with this voodoo ritual where Linda mistakenly thought she killed her stepmother was a bit too much for me, especially since Linda was a key suspect, and it felt like kind of a contrived way to make her look suspicious. Even beyond that, though, I'm also just not a huge fan of this common mystery plot device where one of the characters, unknown to all the other characters, just so happens to be talking about or attempting to do a murder. At the same time, another character is actually doing the murder without any communication or eavesdropping or shared knowledge between the two of them. I'm cool with things being complicated and there being a little bit of coincidence, and in some of Christie's better work, she uses this to her advantage by making the absence of mere coincidence be part of the solution of the mystery rather than part of the obfuscation. So it always feels a little cheap to me when there are a ton of coincidences going on. And then another thing for me that was not really that interesting was this whole background investigation into these past strangling incidents in the English countryside, which, unless I missed something, wasn't heavily hinted at throughout the novel and kind of came out of nowhere at the end. Though admittedly, this wasn't absolutely relevant to the solution of the murder and ended up being just a little bit more of additional backstory for us on the perpetrator. So all in all, not my favorite of the whole bunch, but this was a solid Poirot novel and certainly one worth a read if you get the chance. I suspect that this one would also make an especially good film adaptation just for its interesting tourist location, and I could imagine some of the minor characters being given a little more spice to make them come across at least interesting, even if not directly suspected. Others, though, like the sort of doom-saying Reverend Lane, who seems to be there for no reason other than to recite the Bible verse that gives this story its title, could, I think, be omitted safely without harming the story. Let me know what you thought if you've read this one, and be sure to like and subscribe if you want to hear my upcoming review of Five Little Pigs, or a whole bunch of other weekly reviews on a whole bunch of different topics. Until next time, bye, and happy reading. Having read Christie's prior Poirot novella,